Great. So ethics of AI, I know it is a trend. It's certainly trending a lot. Whether it's something that people are really doing something about and getting excited about, I'm not sure of that. I certainly know the philosophers, the anthropologists, the sociologists are getting more and more excited. And I remember going to Washington, D.C. and spending time at George Mason University. And it was interesting in talking to one of the profs in the anthropology department. They were tasked by the legal department to teach ethics and data ethics. So they're battling to find a home for this in terms of where is the right place to study this. And I must admit, I think we, from a data management point of view, are also going to battle. I'm also involved in the ISO situation in terms of data governance or governance for AI. That's both on the technology and on the data. And one of the things that they are constantly challenged with is defining ethics. Well, what is ethics? So I hope that you guys are slightly interested in this. I think we all need to be. And I just to maybe share a personal embarrassment of mine, I was appointed as the DAMA International Ethics Officer. I attended, I didn't say that I knew anything about it. I just said I was willing to help and I was interested in it. And I attended a meeting and halfway through someone said, but that's not ethical. And I had no idea as to why it was or wasn't ethical. And what struck me was how much we need to learn so that we can judge and we can be part of judging these questions and decisions. I think we all need to get involved. If we look at some of the challenges with Audi and Volkswagen manipulating the data on their emissions, and the fact that the engineer that wrote the code to affect those readings is part of this proceeding, the legal proceeding. I think we as engineers need to have an understanding. I think if we also think about it in terms of autonomous driving, they ask the question, if there's an accident, who's to blame? Is it the designer of the system? Is it the person in the car? Is it the manufacturer? Who is ethically responsible and accountable for these decisions? So I think it's something that we all need to pay attention to. So let's go and see how you guys feel about it. I hope this is valuable to you. This is a book I started reading in 2018 when I went to a conference there, and I know Catherine and Dara O'Brien personally, so they gave me their book. They gave me one of their copies, but it's very helpful, and they refer to it as E2IM, which is Ethical Enterprise Information Management. So the book is a nice read. It's really encouraging in terms of starting from the basics. And they come up with this statement right in the beginning, basically the data-driven dilemma. So this is the position that we as data management professional citizens find ourselves in, given the potential analytics capabilities of AI tools and the data exhaust left behind by people using digital resources. And it's not just that, it's any data that we take on, that we have, and people's usage of that. So this is our dilemma, and I think we have to be aware of it. It's like all sorts of issues that we currently need to deal with and understand. We have to be aware of what it means to us and what it means to our community. Okay, so of course we always like to put things in boxes so that we have a way of understanding. And I like this one in terms of the value and the invasiveness. So how much value are we getting and how invasive is this? And we need to position whatever we're doing into these quadrants or into these areas. So this basically saying that we have high value to the individual and low impact, or there's also society value, social value. And then we have high value, high invasiveness. Now, whenever we see the high invasiveness, we need to pay attention, right? Because it's going to impact us. So we got to pay attention. Now, the thing that also struck me in looking at this thing is this low value, low invasiveness. Well, then why are we doing it? So it's nice when you put this map onto any data project, data analytics, AI, what use case you're trying to do. How many times do you take your use cases and do these matrices for the use case? And it gets a bit more tricky in this analysis. So one of the things that I put on here, and I wanted to just see whether any of you guys are looking at the outcomes. So when you build an AI, when you build some analytics, for example, risk or whatever it is that you're doing, does it violate any of these 4 points? So and sort of questions on that is, does it preserve or enhance human dignity? And before you do that, you've got to understand, well, what is dignity? How do we define dignity? Does it preserve the autonomy of the human? Now, that tends to be your privacy, right? So is it possible for exposure to, and this human is then highlighted? There's an issue there. And is the processing necessary and proportionate? So you'll probably find that in your papaya manuals. And does it uphold the common good? So I was quite interested in terms of asking you guys, if you're applying any form of analytics that doesn't have to be AI, it can be at a lower level. Are you asking yourself any of these questions? Okay. Okay. So that's what's sort of what my guess was, is that I think we are learning to apply this. Is the processing necessary and proportionate? And basically, whenever we share data, we got to ask, what is the purpose of sharing that data? And I think most of us can relate to this one of, is the processing necessary and proportionate? But I think when it probably comes to individuals in terms of trying to understand who they are, I'm not sure how far we go down in terms of, does it preserve the autonomy of the human? So, and there it changed. But these are your basic privacy stuff. So anyone involved in Papaya, we got this. These ones are the harder ones, which is common good. So common good is interesting as well, because that definition changes, and we have an organizational challenge there as well, and we'll get to that one a little bit later. Are there any questions? Anyone want to pass a comment, question, observation? Okay. All right. So I wanted to just talk through a scenario with you. This is one of the nice things about the book, is that it actually has many case studies, and then it asks you these 4 points. So if we talk of health identifiers, and that may be watches that we wear, it may be devices that we carry, And certainly when we're dealing with the elderly in terms of Alzheimer's and stuff like that, they even putting cameras there. They had a really nice use case about the use of cameras for Alzheimer's, and it all, when I read it, it sounded quite amazing, because what it was trying to do was that if a person with Alzheimer's had a meeting with an individual, they could turn on this camera so that when they went home or whatever it is, they could replay the camera and they could remember what they spoke about. I shouldn't really laugh, but I'm just thinking of my father-in-law who passed away, and he used to make copious notes, and he managed to disguise this for some time, and we didn't realize how bad it was because of his note-taking, and he was able to remember so much. So now with these cameras, they're even better, but the camera brought in all sorts of other issues, like now, has the person that's been filmed been made aware of it? Have they? Is there something that you can compromise them from? So it wasn't so much the person with Alzheimer's, but the situation that they were in. So these are typical health identifiers that you have. Okay. Now, and I'm sure this if you guys are using things like your Fitbits and your Apple Watch and Strava and all these type of things, you record all of this data for discovery, and I'm sure others are collecting it as well. Now, the data it's everything from heart rate to the way you're feeling, in some cases what you're eating, and things like that. These health identifiers are just about collecting every single thing that you do that may be related to your health. Okay. So it's interesting the responses that we're getting. So what we are seeing is that the common good and the preserve human dignity are high up the list in terms of justifications for all of these health identifiers. They one of the top things in terms of the promise of the benefit that they give back to us. Now, where we're finding a lot of the challenges come in is the data that's been kept on, that's been collected by us. So just the inappropriate use, for example, could affect things like your life insurance. Okay. And things that you declare, you even having things of now having doctors linked to you, and you have results that are coming in within this health wallet or this health information. So this is certainly an area where things can go wrong, and companies can start biasing their decisions depending on the information that they get, and then we tend to lose this human autonomy, right? Now, one could always argue, well, is it not the truth? Is this not what it is? And so should they not make this available? That becomes an ethical discussion and a question. And then this necessary and proportionate, I think this is also an area where I think we're going overboard. It's just about let's collect everything and then see what's helpful, rather than let's collect what we need. I mean, if I think about some of the measurements and statistics that I'm giving on my Garmin device, and also to Discovery in terms of my heart rate, my heartbeat, my resting heart rate, It's just about everything that I do and I feel and I operate is going through the system, and is it necessary and proportionate? So I'm finding there's very few things that they turn down. So I'm not convinced about the level of checking as to whether it's necessary and proportionate. Now, if I was an elderly gentleman and I was in fear of falling or having an accident or not breathing or having a heart attack, I get that. I get this necessary and proportionate in terms of you want to know about everything that's possible, but they're collecting the data irrespective of age and condition. They just collect. So I think there's some tricky areas in this field over here. Comments, questions?
I would just maybe just a general comment. I think the one thing that we've picked up is typically that way we want to collect all the data and then determine what AI we want to apply to it, and what might be useful. Very recently, in terms of voice recording, so we want to train a model to start getting to NLP type models, and the thing was just give us all the voice recordings rather than get the bare minimum that's going to be useful to train the model. The question is sort of give me everything, and then I'll determine what's relevant. And I think if we do it the other way around in terms of maybe taking some time to determine what is actually required and only focusing on that and then justifying it rather than just saying, giving me everything, because that's the one issue with data science and ML and those things is just, we want everything and then we'll tell you what we can use.
Right. I think if that must be the core point for every one of us is in terms of saying we've got to stop the give me everything, because that's getting us into trouble. And it can lead to more and more trouble. Whereas if we're now asking the questions, we're validating it, we're quantifying it, then we start getting a better understanding of what our use case is, what is deemed to be successful, and have we achieved the value that we need. And so I think we have to get more rigid about the approach that we take to defining what is it that we're going to look at.
So interesting on that, Howard, Corneille. Last year I did Bob Free for Namibia, and working with their regulator and obviously with the local guys and Visa and MasterCard and all that. And on the normal banking and all that for Bob reporting, it was fine. We could draw up the models and assess which data is required for Bob Free reporting. But on the card, that was quite a challenge because the guys came back, that was the opposite of the discussion we're having now. They said, you tell me exactly the data you require, and then we'll provide that, and you do your reporting, your Bob reporting according to that when it comes to cards. And with that approach, the project actually took 6 months longer to deliver, because then you have to go and build your model, extrapolate your report, compare your reporting, then discover, okay, this is the data I'm still missing, go back and redo that whole thing. So I hear exactly the point that don't tell us, give us everything. And that can be a lack of planning and understanding exactly what you want to get to at the end of the day. But there we had exactly what's the requirement in terms of reporting, but just understanding where do you do the aggregation of the data made that it caused a bit of, or not, well, that's one of the factors that caused a delay of about 6 months in getting ready to deliver that project.
Right. And so what I am finding is now people are getting clever at profiling the data, and maybe that's the wrong term, but what we are seeing is some very clever techniques, statistical techniques, in looking at the layout of the columns to help you make a decision about what data you need and what's going to be helpful to you. And I believe that's the right approach when you're doing this almost discovery type of thing. You could be looking at the data from a linear regression point of view or a statistical analysis of the data rather than just give me all the data.
No, definitely. Well, having said that, if the data classification was in a better state, then also it would be a non-issue. Then, and if the banks apply the appropriate level of data classification and management, I believe, well, that's my personal view, that regulatory reporting projects would be a walk in the park. Except in the instances where you need to go and build something specifically for it. But now when you have a project like that, you have to basically start from scratch because you don't understand your data.
Okay. Yeah, I think that's part of what a couple of things of what we're doing now is trying to have a better profile of the information that we have and is it applicable to our use. And I think we have to get better at that than just saying, give me everything. And so we've got to strike the balance in terms of what we can see in the data. All right. So I did mention earlier on that this is one of the first things that you have to start at with respect to your organization. And it's another one of those, I'm not sure. Yeah, it was the same as the organizational culture discussion we had. I think it was with the executives. You now got to have the organizational ethics. So it's the same approach. Now, there's 5 different ways of defining and measuring these ethical theories. So you've got virtue-based, you've got deontological approach, you've got a consequential approach, you've got a justice-based, and then you've got the business have got to define, are they stakeholder or stockholder focused? And these are the interesting ones. So virtue-based, I think we know that from legal systems. And the question there is, what would a virtuous person do with this information that they received? But then you've got to have this strongly defined virtuous person, and we may not all be able to understand what that person understands. So it makes it a little bit harder. Then we've got the action and duty. So this is quite nice in terms of taking this approach where you say, what is my duty with respect to this data in protecting individuals and society? Okay, then you've got consequential ethics, and this is it's always it's a backward looking thing, and this is the problem that you have with ethics, is that today it's fine, that's nothing wrong, but down the road it's terrible. What you've done is terrible. So if it caused a problem down the road, that is what's referred to consequential ethics. And so you can start off thinking everything's fine, I'm doing it for the right good and stuff like that. But then you find out and you discover that you've been impacting certain parts of the population that you shouldn't be. And this is a very negative approach. So one just asks themselves now is, if you were to answer this question now, well, if I knew what the outcome of dropping a bomb on Hiroshima was going to be, or the use of Agent Orange, then would we do it? There's a question that people battle with. Then justice-based ethical approach means that we focus on ensuring equality. Everybody has to be treated equal, and we have to increase the justice. So and then we've got, as I explained earlier, stakeholder versus stockholder. So are we here to produce value from a stockholder point of view and a stakeholder point of view? Now that's becoming slightly a moot point when we deal with King 4 that talks about the protecting the stakeholders. Okay, so these are the approaches. Now, once again, we're starting to analyze AI, but we haven't gone back to our business and said, what ethical basis do we apply as an organization? So I always find this hard as a case of you asking me to define ethics at an AI level, but you haven't even told me what the ethics are of the organization and how we measure it. And you haven't done one. So help me understand this, and then we go back to this thing of saying, okay, let's go and define it properly at the organizational level or at the country level, wherever we're at, and then we can apply it to AI. Okay. Any comments or questions on that? Everyone's very quiet today. Hussein, any comments from you?
No, I'm good. Just condensing the information.
Okay.
I think it's an excellent topic.
Right.
And obviously, for me, I think ethics is quite a broad topic.
Yes.
And it's an interesting comment you made earlier on. Where would we study this, or what sort of discipline does it apply to?
Right.
I think for me, probably it applies to almost every discipline or topic that we look at, and it's becoming much more topical as time goes on, in terms of data breaches and misuse of
Yes.
information and fraud and things which take place.
Yeah. Good. Thanks. All right. So that's we got to understand this ethical theory, and we've got to build one in terms of our organization. Once we have a clear steer from that point of view, then we can start setting up these frameworks in terms of managing our ethics on projects and AI projects. Okay. Now, this is where we sort of getting involved with multiple areas of study at universities. So, for example, we have ethics of the society that we're in. And our problem now is that when we talk about big data and let's talk about Bitcoin, which society are we referring to? We're almost referring to the world. Okay, so this is a little bit hard. Then we have ethics of the organization. Now that's more your anthropology type of scenario. That's almost at a community-based level. Then we have ethic of an individual, and these all produce outcomes. So the individual and the organizational and the organization create outcomes, and then we have a feedback loop from society to say, what are their expectations of what we're doing? Now, this has probably got to be one of the more critical areas that you have to be asking and getting feedback from society on a regular basis. This can't be when we have a problem, let's go and ask society what it's all about. We have to be asking them repeatedly and getting the feedback all the time so that we can sense that something's going wrong. That some form of bias has crept into our data. So now we have to find a way of integrating society into our outcomes and getting them to view and comment on our outcomes. And this is where you get the stakeholder, is society is the stakeholder, right? If we just think of Enron was the first one that brought this about when they had to retrench so many people because they had misused all the pension funds. The society, it wasn't just the individual within the organization, but it was their families and the communities that they supported. So that's where society is getting involved in. It's not just the person or the customer. There's a whole lot of people on the other side, and hence the stakeholder analysis that we have to look at. Okay, so this is now where we've now understood the organization. We're getting into a better definition when we understand the interests of the organization. So here we have an interest of the individual. Here we have high organization value and low individual interest. So there's lots of interest from the organization and little interest from the individual. So here is just basically as a nice summary, individual is a means to an end. We need to consider how to improve safeguards and reduce the evasiveness and impact of processing. So here the organization's winning, and the individual, it doesn't really care much. Here is a area where we map our data or our cases, our results, where we're getting the interests, and we're serving interests both of the organization and the individual. Here, in this situation, it's more about the individual than the organization, so it's of low value to the organization. And then where we got to be careful of this is the type of project in here leads to some bad behavior down the road. When people start asking the questions, well, what are we getting out of it? And so we started off saying that we didn't want anything about it, but then pressure mounts, and all of a sudden the data is being misused. So these are tricky ones that you've got to keep paying attention to and ensuring that we don't go off the rails. And then low organization, low individual, guys, we're really just wasting time here. So unless there's some form of value from an administrative point of view, we got to try and stay away from projects or data collection issues around this area over here. Okay. Now, this is something that is becoming important when we look at algorithms. And I don't know whether you guys have been reading a lot on the OECD in terms of how we're going to manage algorithms, and specifically on algorithms relating to open data. What they are suggesting is that we create these send the algorithm to the data. All right, so they're trying to suggest to companies to stop collecting the data and rather send the algorithm to the person that has the data. Now, I'll give you some examples. Areas like Stats SA, in terms of some of the data sets, they've got in the region of 1 billion data points on some of the data sets that they're collecting for the economy. And we have to be careful now of everyone trying to get a copy of that data. So we're trying to look at ways of how do we send the algorithm to the data. Now, before anyone will allow an algorithm to come and access their data, so you can also have a scenario where you've got communities that are collecting data, and you want to allow an algorithm to come and look at the data, and they can get financially rewarded for the data. We need to have a way of auditing these algorithms. Okay, so if we want to audit the algorithms, this takes quite a bit of time. And I don't know if any of you guys have tried to audit an AI algorithm. And I really like the one person that said, guys, from a mathematical point of view, mathematics, the statistical analysis, it cannot be biased. It's the data and the way in which it's used and the correlation that creates the bias. So it's not easy to look at an algorithm and make a decision on the algorithm on its own. And I remember there was actually not a competition, but a reward that was given for somebody to, if they could spot the flaw in the algorithm. I think there was a bias that this algorithm caused all sorts of problems. It took the person who won answered after 2 years. They found a potential challenge that the algorithm had. Now, so that's got to be a really hard thing of saying, well, now we're going to ship algorithms around. How are we going to take care of them? So I like the way you guys have answered. One of the top areas must be responsibility and accountability. So if something goes wrong with this algorithm, who's accountable? So we have to allocate people, and we have to allocate responsibility to humans to be able to get involved in the output of the algorithm before the decision is made. So this is really important to us. Explainability. Only now are we starting to see algorithms that if they make a decision, they can explain how they got there. And you can go and review that. Accuracy can also be tricky. That tends to be more on the data point of view. Auditability, we're getting much better results in terms of the decisions that it's making and taking and what sort of consequences they're having. And then we have this fairness where we're trying to assure that the algorithm is fair. But again, that's pretty hard in terms of looking at an algorithm, and they're almost hanging them out to dry, and anyone can analyze them, and they've got to be registered, and then they have an ongoing assessment of those algorithms. So this is where things are going in terms of algorithms that we are creating. And when we build these AI algorithms for use within the company, we have to ask these questions, and we have to see whether the algorithm adheres to these principles. Any questions from anyone on vetting algorithms? Okay. Are you guys all just trusting me today? There's very few.
Absolutely.
Howard, we're scared we're saying something unethical, so we're just trying to figure out where the boundaries are.
Careful, I got the recording on, yeah. The problem with ethics can make people go very quiet. Okay. All right.
Howard, sorry, maybe I will just. I remember something that you told me. You told me a story a long time ago about a question mark an insurance company had. I think it was a case study they did where there was a bus full of people driving on a pass, and there was a car in front of with 100 people in the bus. There was a car in front of them with 2 people, and the bus's brakes fail. And they used scenarios with AI to determine what the bus driver should do.
Yeah.
In terms of
the claim. Training. So it was actually part of a training that they were trying to. Yeah. So they had this thing of. It was an insurance company that was involved in one of the bus driving or those firms, and they were trying to check to see whether the bus driver could make the appropriate decision.
And they had to decide between the 100 or the 2 people in front of them.
Yeah.
Which lives would be more less costly or whatever it was.
Yeah.
So yeah, is that the subject around how to determine those, make those decisions?
So ethically, how would we determine what's right? Okay, so now if you take that's a good example, Paul. Thanks for that. If you take an outcomes based, right, then you're definitely going to say kill the 2, right?
Yes. From an insurance point of view, yeah.
Yeah. So there's how you'd look at those different theories and ask yourself the question, well, what does this mean? And how's it? Yeah. Now, and I don't know if so people started realizing that they were too scared to make the decision, just like what Zane was saying. They didn't want to make that decision. So then they said, well, let's crowdsource the ethical decision. So what does that mean? Well, they then went and I think they've got this, I'll share the website, and they then hand the question over to the people. And what they wanted to do is, well, if 5 million people agree that this is the right answer, then that's the answer we're going to go for. So now let's get society to define what is ethical. And this was on autonomous driving cars, and I don't know if I've ever shared that with you, but I went on and I decided to play. And so what they did was they had this car situation, and they then had, for example, there was a lady next to me that had a baby, and I was about to go into a brick wall. What do? Do I kill myself and the occupants, or do I kill the lady and the baby? And then they had a granny with a dog. Do I run them over? All these type of things. And I think within 5 minutes, it was just too much for me. I couldn't handle it anymore. So I said, okay, enough of this. And then I went and read the comments. And the one guy's comment was, you're not giving me enough information. Please tell me if the driver of the vehicle had serviced their vehicle in the last 10 or whatever period, 10 months or whatever it was. And they then said, depending on whether they had been this virtuous person, if they hadn't failed, then they must die.
Wow.
And the other challenge that you have with the area of ethics is there is no redemption to ethics. So you can't redeem yourself. If you did something bad, you can't redeem. Ethics doesn't have any redeeming aspects to it. So if you're a murderer, then that's the way you are, and that's the consequence of it. So there are some challenges, and it's not easy, but you've got to start applying some level of thinking to it, because people are going to ask you these questions, and you have to put the protection in place. So one of the things that was suggested by this book, which I quite like, is they've taken the Amsterdam information management model. So we see strategic, which is data strategy and governance. Then we get this structural and tactical. This is our planning and architecture. We get into operations, and then stakeholders. So how do we bring the stakeholder into this game? So what we have to do then is match the outcome of the processes and the information with the expectation. And this is what we have to bring into our information model. And we've, by and large, ignored all of these areas of stakeholder expectation and society. And now we have to bring these two into play to help us get an understanding of what our impact is. Okay. So I like this. I like this involvement here of our stakeholders and what are they looking at. Now, in saying that, we had some discussion with this same bunch in the George Mason University, and they've now got sociology, the challenges with digital sociology. Can anyone give me an idea of what they would see as some of the problems of doing digital sociology? Any things that you've noticed in terms of this, because we've all been involved in this digital sociology. So maybe to explain it better, it's how I respond on a digital medium. So sociologists argue that the root truth is when you communicate directly with an individual and you have a certain number of interactions and discussions with the individual, and they say that without going to the root of the truth, you will never get the appropriate feedback from your stakeholders. And we know how we can respond in terms of email. You guys have seen the ping pong email, how vicious it can get. You can see what it looks like on Twitter in terms of getting stakeholder feedback on Twitter. Anybody seen some of that?
Yeah.
Even sort of what I see is, sorry, Zane.
Yeah, so I think that from that perspective, how it is, you sort of get a response. I mean, it's looking at our company and things people typically post when they have issues. You don't really get you get a sense of disgruntledness or anger or whatever it might be, but you don't really get to the underlying, what is it that's actually causing the problem.
100%. So now we're trying to say, okay, well, let's try to automate this stakeholder engagement. How else is the machine going to learn without some level of digital stakeholder engagement? Now, I mean, I know we could do that. We could survey the people all the time manually, go and talk to them, bring all the data in, bring it back into the machine. But it's going to become impractical, right? So now their challenge is how do they engage in this persona or role playing that people get involved with when it comes to digital surveys, and the fact that they can get so intense and it just, when you read some of it after a while, you think, wow, how did we ever get here? This is the problem area. And sociology is, I mean, there's these factions of people that want to go completely digital. They want to survey everybody online, to others saying you can't get the truth. You're going to get a biased view. So not easy in terms of dealing with this. Now, these are challenges. I don't have the answers for those sort of things, but it's the type of model that we have to bring in place, where we talk about the ethics of society, the ethics of the organization. We then got to bring in law. So GDPR, Papaya, and GDPR has a level of ethics involved in it, but remember, it's predominantly privacy, which can have an autonomy aspect to it, but it's not all of the ethics in terms of harm that you're causing. And then you've got lobbying to the society. How does the organization lobby the society via whatever mechanisms, standards and codes, and industry practices? And then we've got this customer education and information, and I think there's a critical part to it. So how do we educate our customers? And it was interesting there, Zane, when I look at some of the track and trace that was happening, the level of education, and maybe I'm wrong, but I hardly saw any of it.
Yeah. And I mean, it's they started with the rollout of it, but honestly, if you didn't work on the project and you know what happened, there's not a lot happening.
Yeah. So this is becoming a critical part in now. How do we educate, and it's society as well. So we've got stakeholder, that wider range. How are we going to educate? And then it's this customer feedback and expectations that we start getting back into the system. So this is typically what we're looking at when we have to start putting together a ethical E2IM, and then also, as we saw previously, was the impact assessment. So where does it sit in those quadrants? If it's in a quadrant that's not right, what have we got to do to reduce the invasiveness or the low interest from an individual point of view? And how do we get it into a quadrant that makes sense to us? And then how do we keep it there? And so this is the approach that we have to start looking at. Of course, we have to deal with the algorithms as well, in terms of the auditability, trace, and explanation and things like that. But we have to start thinking at a much higher level and a wider level when it comes to ethics and the use of AI. Guys, any questions, any observations, or I suppose the one thing that I forgot to is just what do you guys see as your biggest take home or feedback from this discussion?
So Howard, I think the main thing, so this sort of piggybacks off the discussion we had last week around the role that culture actually plays within an organization. Right. And I think one of the things that we typically see, for instance, is maybe the overlap between culture, well, let's say organizational culture and ethics, and sort of how those lines starts to blur, specifically around this model, right? The one you've got now. Yes. Because just as much as culture affects it, we need to be cognizant and aware of ethics across all those dimensions. Where, in my own world, we typically more focusing on the ethics from an operations perspective, but then when it comes to strategy and the tactical stuff, it's not sort of like the second thing that you think about. When it comes to operations, then we'll think, is it actually ethical to do this, et cetera, et cetera. But it should actually be a top-down approach, right?
Correct, because you're making yourself responsible for deciding what's ethical.
The other thing that contributes is how a person's effectiveness and performance is measured. So it ties down to the KPIs and all that. So that will also, in a big way, determine the behavior.
Yeah.
I guess the other important point which we mentioned was the stakeholder versus stockholder, and and I guess the stockholder also needs to be educated about ethics, so that it's not always profit maximization.
Right, and it does go back into that sustainability of the organization. So the stakeholder is not always concerned about the long-term sustainability. They're looking for the impact on the profit.
Yeah.
Okay, now, guys, I didn't want to go too far, and what I did want to show you was that there's another framework on ethical information management, very similar to that of data quality, where you can analyze the data that you have, analyze the quality from an ethical perspective, and then assess the business impact. And then we go into potentially finding root causes of ethical issues within the data, develop improvement plans, and then we keep on going, prevent future ethical issues, and fix current. So we go around in terms of this. And there's another one for the individual where we have to look at, do we find an ethical impact for the individual? And then we have ways of understanding what the decision was taken, what actions and things like that. So there's quite a lot involved in these aspects, and both bringing the society in, bringing the individual in, and bringing the organization together. So there's so much here in terms of looking after the ethical side of this data. Things like when we bring in these AI and we've got people making decisions, what is their locus of control? And I always like that one. Is someone's suggestion is to deal with ethical issues, you put a human in the process, and I agree with that. I get it. So before the result is passed over to communicated to the customer, there must be a human being that communicates. But if they have very little locus of control, i.e., they can't ask the machine to explain or audit its findings or explain what do these people say to the customers? And then how do they respond from an ethical point of view to the customer? So when we get involved in these type of interactions between AI systems and society and individuals, we've got quite a lot of work to do. Okay. Any further comments? Any last comments?
No, I agree 100% out. There was an interesting debate in the last week or so on LinkedIn as well. So what makes a good CEO? One that focuses on people, or one that focuses on the bottom line. So obviously everyone likes the thing where they say the CEO focus on people. But there was a lot of comments that said it's nice and ethically and theoretically that sounds very nice. But if the CEO does not focus on the bottom line and focus more on the people, eventually he will not have a company that can focus on the people. So it's always an interesting debate when it comes to ethics and culture and sustainability.
Yeah, and I think what's been done in that area, Corne, and I think King 4 created that, are those dual boards, right? Where you have the ethical whistleblowing and reporting goes up to a different level than management. So CEO is responsible for management and the effective and efficiency of management, whereas the dual board is responsible for the ethical evaluation of decisions and things like that. So they are splitting those up and trying to separate that. So to overcome what you're just saying there now is one person having to try to make these type of decisions, and they can't do a good job on either side. They challenged on both sides. Guys, thank you very much.
Thanks, everybody. It's been sure another eye opener and interesting topic to chew on. But thanks very much, Howard, for your input and for the learning.
Awesome. Thanks, Paul. Thanks, Howard. Cheers, guys.
Thanks, guys.
Cheers.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Cheers.
Cheers, Corne.